One of the biggest areas of contention within nutritional science is certainly red meat. And this is likely because there's a lot of dogma and ideology surrounding it and a lot of strong biases between the plant-based side and omnivore-carnivore side that sort of informs a lot of the discussion. But the other issue is really just the nutritional epidemiology and the nutritional science. Unfortunately, due to the nature of trying to study nutrition, it's just very difficult to do it in a really well-controlled way. We have ways of doing it in ward studies where we can control the entire environment, we control all the food, but this is very difficult. We're confining people in a tight space and it's very expensive. So it's hard to do this over a long time to be able to get good data on, say, things like mortality and disease progression, which takes many years, if not decades, to show. And so inevitably we end up relying on epidemiology. And unfortunately, epidemiology is just fraught with many issues due to the nature of the type of research it is. So this is basically where we just ask people questions and we kind of follow them and maybe check in with them a couple times. They often use things like food frequency questionnaires. So there's not a lot of control within this type of research. And unfortunately, this leads to a lot of issues. To make matters worse, there is the whole business of research and business of science nowadays, where people become more concerned with publishing data and getting grants than actually trying to find the truth and come out with the actual results. And so what happens is people do things like p-hacking, where they sort of modify the statistics in order to show something exciting in order to get published. Or, on the worst side, if you want to be more cynic, depending on where their funding is coming from or where their personal biases are and where their beliefs are, that may inform what they end up using for statistical analysis to show the results that they want. And in fact, this has been researched, and they have shown that researchers' beliefs and expectations do adjust the results that they get within their papers. And so unfortunately, humans are humans, and we do succumb to biases and our own human errors. And so to account for this, there is actually a different and much more complicated way of doing some statistical analysis to potentially remove some of that bias and do it in a more randomized way. Because again, we still have to use epidemiology. So we have to figure out how can we use statistical analysis to remove some of that variability and bias. And keep in mind, of course, always with statistical analysis, there's going to be some downsides. It's not an exact tool. People who don't understand the research, when they see publications, research shows XYZ, they don't understand that a lot of the time they're using statistical tools to account for variables and confounders and different things. And these are just not exact and not that precise a lot of the times. And there are a lot of different tools. And so what this new paper did is they used a new type of statistical analysis called specific curve analysis, also called multiverse analysis. And that's because they're basically looking at every single potential statistical tool and variable that they can use, and then using all of them, or at least a random sample of those, in order to remove that potential bias. So they're not selecting the tool they want to use. They're just taking a random sample of all the available tools, at least the ones that logically make sense and that can be used for this type of research. Specifically, it uses all of the plausible and justifiable statistical tools. So let's have a look at this paper and what they were looking at in relation to red meat and all-cause mortality. Now, they reviewed a particular systematic review that had 15 publications and 24 cohort studies within it. And they ended up with about a little over 10,000 eligible participants, and they removed some potential people due to exclusions that they had outlined. And to get a sense of the variability in statistical analysis that can be used, this study actually calculated how many potential analyses could be done, and they came up with the number 10 quadrillion possible unique analyses. So that gives you an idea of the extent of variability within this research and how complex it is and how much we have to leverage statistical tools to get the results that we want. Now, obviously, they couldn't analyze all 10 quadrillion potentials. What they did was they took a random sample and then used those ones. So of that, they had about 1,440 unique specifications that they could analyze. And the data that they're using for this was from the NHANES database between 2007 and 2014. They also used the National Death Index and the Food Patterns Equivalence database. And admittedly, they discussed some of the limitations with this type of data, being the NHANES data a relatively shorter period of time. If we're talking about all-cause mortality, it's good to see a longer amount of time. But they talk about in this paper how this is more a proof of concept of using the statistical tool than really diving into the results of the red meat and all-cause mortality. We can still infer some of the results that they found and sort of use that to inform our greater understanding within the space, looking at other data. But just keep in mind, there are some limitations here. And even the fact that, they've only taken 1,440 out of the potential 10 quadrillion, that's a limitation as well. So they're still having to use statistics, which means there's still room for error and issues within these types of tools, but it at least removes the potential bias of selecting the particular stats that you want to get the results that you would prefer. Now, when they looked at the research, this is the results that they found for it. So they found that the median hazard ratio for red meat and all-cause mortality was 0.94. So a refresher on hazard ratios, a hazard ratio of 1 means there's no difference, whether increased or reduced. Anything above 1 would suggest an increased risk. Anything below 1 would suggest a reduction in risk. And so a hazard ratio of 0.94 would suggest a small effect of a reduction in all-cause mortality. Now, when they analyzed a lot of this data, what they found was that majority of it was not statistically significant. And that's interesting because, a lot of the papers in the systematic reviews and a lot of the epidemiology, they tend to show the results as being statistically significant. And this would suggest that that's likely because they're choosing particular stats to try to get a positive result so that they can be published. But within here, they still found some. So when they analyzed the amount of data that was statistically significant, it was only 48 or 3.97%. So a very small subset was actually statistically significant, which tells us that the majority of the data shows there's no correlation to red meat and all-cause mortality. When we look at that about 4%, what they found was that 40 of the 48 had indicated a reduction in all-cause mortality, and 8 of the 48 showed an increase in all-cause mortality. So we can infer from this that, if anything, there seems to be a reduction in all-cause mortality, and this was apparent more in women than in men when they analyzed for those two variables. So interesting data. Again, this probably goes against the status quo and a lot of the rhetoric around red meat and being bad for everything. But we do have a growing amount of data now with this paper and many other papers, including RCTs and Mendelian randomizations, that are now giving us a better picture of the fact that red meat likely isn't associated with all-cause mortality. That includes many chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. And if anything, there's some papers now showing that there is a potential benefit, particularly in those who are malnourished. So whether that applies to those of us in the West who are mostly overfed, maybe not the case. But in general, even from an evolutionary perspective, if we look at things from first principles, there's a bit of discordance. It doesn't quite make sense that foods we've consumed for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, would suddenly be causing all of the disease that we're seeing in the last 100 years or so. And so I think the data will continue to grow and show us more and more that it's not associated with the potential for all-cause mortality, and we'll probably get more data around specific diseases. Of course, there is always context and nuance, and everyone's different. So, if you have, say, hemochromatosis, then you need to be mindful of excess iron intake. Maybe if you're one of the few in the population who are hypersensitive to saturated fat, maybe there's a consideration there. But for the vast majority of people, likely that the consumption of red meat is not associated with all-cause mortality, particularly if you're getting it from well-sourced foods. You're getting grass-fed, organic steak, and you're not getting red meat in the form of pizza and hot dogs, right? Always have to consider those variables, which a lot of people tend not to think about. So overall, really interesting study design. Hopefully we see more research that is using this type of tool, and we get more of the epidemiology within nutrition that gets reviewed under a finer comb to be able to delineate a little bit more of our food guidelines. And maybe we'll start to see some change in the discussions around red meat over time based on more of this research coming out. But if you enjoyed that content, then make sure to like and subscribe. And of course, you can join my private group where I share more of the research and information that I come across, and you can always ask me any questions there. And if you wanted to work with me, then you can book a free discovery down below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video.